Hey folks, it's Friday, so once again we're going to be going through Johan's replies to the latest Tinto Talks. That was all around combat in Project Caesar, aka EU5. There were a lot of answers by Johan this week. I think there was 12 pages, which is more than double what we usually get. A lot of them did cover the same kind of thing, so I picked out the best replies. As always, I will leave a link to the post in the description, so if you do want to go through and read all his replies, it'll be down there for you to do so. But as I said, just picked out the most relevant ones. Some of them were hinting towards next week's Dev Diary, which is all around logistics, so I did leave those ones out because we will talk about that in a dedicated video next week. As always, if you do enjoy the video, please hit that like button. It helps other people find the channel and these kind of videos in the future. But let's get into the first question. You've said previously that battles will be more decisive. How is that going to be? Johan's saying here that there's going to be more war score from battles, so I'm not sure what the cutoff is in EU4. In Crusader Kings 3, I think it's usually 50% of war score is capped, so you can't get more than that just from battles. You can from other kinds of Casus Belli, but the usual ones, it is capped at 50%, so I'm not sure how high it's going to go, but Johan's saying you get more war score from battles, and there's less cap on war score from battles. So you are going to get more points from fighting, and then there isn't going to be a cap on how many of those actually count towards your war. And then the other bit is obviously dead soldiers equal dead people. So as the armies are linked to your population, battles are going to be more decisive, because I guess if you do like stack wipe someone or something, that is a lot of people out of their kind of pool of manpower. And they're not like in EU4 where you just refill it from manpower. Well, I guess you are kind of refilling it from that manpower, but then your population is then having to refill that manpower pool as well. So it's really going to affect your realm, and that is going to have these like knock-on effects, I think, which will cause wars to end quicker. Maybe you'll see people maybe surrender quicker. I wonder if there's any kind of mechanics for people trying to get out of wars a little bit faster, but not quite as punishing as in EU4. Because once you've lost one or two battles, I imagine you're going to want to get out of wars, because it's going to affect your industry and things like that so much as you lose population. But good to see here, they are going to be more decisive. I think we will see wars end a little bit quicker as well. Obviously, next week as well, we're going to see how sieges work. Maybe that is also going to play a major part into it. I'm sure it will. The next one, how do stack wipes work? Do reinforcing armies get a penalty to initiative? So this is a major change. This wasn't in the dev diary, but it is something that really does change how battles happen. So Johan's reply to this is reinforcing armies end up with their regiments in the reserve box, so the chance of them actually joining the battle has another impact first as well. So this is kind of linked to some things that were in the dev diary, where he was saying having these big doom stacks is less efficient because a lot of your troops are going to be in the reserves. They're not really doing anything. You would be better, as we thought in that video, of having two armies and then they could fight different battles. Now, I think some people thought, well, I'll just have two armies, bring them into the battle separately, and then you've got like 6 fronts in the battle, or something like that if you want to think of it that way. What Johan's saying here is if you reinforce an army with another army, it actually just goes into the reserves box. It isn't like another front, or it isn't just adding troops straight into the front lines. They actually just go into the stack of reserves. So this does kind of reinforce what he was saying as well, where the morale of armies is more important, and we will see these battles end a little bit quicker than they do in EU4, and he will go into that a little bit more in one of the later questions. But really saying here, like, you can reinforce these armies, kind of making these doom stacks as you kind of pile armies in, but it isn't actually that useful because they just go into the reserves and then they've got to wait their turn to actually fight in the battle. So that is going to prevent you just having these massive doom stacks everywhere, or kind of trying to game that system by making them out of smaller armies, I would think. In the next question, are there any plans for nice immersive graphical representation of actual battle? Johan's reply, just hell yes. So I guess we are going to see some kind of graphical representation, as he says, on the map. So maybe we'll see not like a full battle. Maybe you'll see like 2 sets of infantry shooting at each other, something like that. I can't imagine we're going to get anything outside of that, like mini UI showing the actual troops fighting each other. I don't think we'll get anything quite like that. It would be pretty cool. Maybe something, if you've played Millennia, that game had some interesting graphical choices. But one of the kind of cool things was when you fought each other, it did have this like graphical UI that came up, and you actually saw the units fighting each other. It was with some interesting graphics, as I said. But I think if they did a version like that, it would be pretty nice to see, especially as we know the actual amount of troops fighting each other is limited in a certain way. So I think it could be pretty cool. I think what he does mean, though, is that we'll just see some like cavalry, artillery, or maybe just infantry kind of just shooting each other on the map a little bit. In the next question, actually 2 questions. Am I correct in assuming that 3 squares on the right of each regiment is their designated section? And Johan say, yes, it is their section. So we did talk about this, the 3 pips on the left-hand side. I did say it was a little bit weird they were stood up. I thought they'd be laid down if it was talking about their position, but Johan clarifying that is the case. So the top pip is the left flank, the center one is the center, and the bottom pip, I guess, is the right-hand pip. I will say in another question I don't think I put up here, he does say the one that is in silver means they're in reserve. So if they have all 3 pips filled out and it's silver, they're reserves. Everyone else is where they are designated in the line. And then in the second question he had here, if a reinforcing army joins the battle, will the units with right flank not join the left flank if it's collapsing due to its assignment, or will it reinforce like a unit assigned to reserves? Johan saying it will be assigned to the reserves. So kind of backing up what he said in the last question, any armies kind of joining in are just going to go into the reserves and then get reassigned as and when that works out. In the next question, will there be any dice roll modifier penalties for attacking defenders depending on vegetation and topography? Yes. I think we kind of knew this from the early dev diary about locations, where he said every location has like 3 attributes to it. I think it did make sense even then to think, well, each one of these areas, like, is it wooded? Is it hilly? Is it dry? Is it marshlands? Something like that. I think we all knew that would take effect in your battles. As to how much it actually will do, we'll see obviously later on. The next question about after combat, does the winning side get anything like salvage goods? For example, horses, weaponry, or prisoners? Johan's reply, yes, there are benefits to winning, but obviously one of these cryptic replies where he doesn't really elaborate any further than that. But it would be interesting, I think, if you did a battle and then you managed to like steal their cannon if they weren't destroyed. Maybe you could take their horses. I imagine you might take prisoners or something. That would be pretty cool. Maybe you could put them to work in your industry or something like that. We'll see a lot more. I guess maybe next week we might find out more with logistics. That might cover after a battle what happens then. But it is cool that we are going to get some version of this, and it isn't going to be just you fight somebody, you kill them, and then like you just have to reinforce and all that other kind of mechanics. It does look like we are going to get some other bonus as well for defeating other armies. The next question, I didn't actually put the question up here. This is really just for you to look at. Johan did actually give us a spreadsheet. Everyone likes a good spreadsheet. Really showing what the effectiveness, the combat power, and the army size changes are during the 6 ages of the game. You can see that on the screen now. As I said, if you want to take a look at this closely, there is a link in the description down below. But this was really him showing like these are the changes, because people kept asking like what's the difference from early on to later on, etc. And you can see like infantry size 100 at the beginning goes up to 3,200 in the revolutions. Combat power, you can see cavalry doesn't really ever change. Cavalry just kind of stays the same. I think that does make sense. But infantry does get better. It starts at 1 combat power, and then by the end it's level 3. Artillery again 2 up to 8 as artillery gets better and better. And then again, on the right-hand side, you can see effectiveness, how effective those units are. And you can see they just get better and better as the ages progress. As the technology gets better, these units are better at fighting. It is going to be a progression like in EU4. He did say in some other questions that we are going to get, I think, a wider range of units. Somebody asked when we would find that out, and he said much later. So I guess that might be an autumn or a fall dev diary. But it does sound like we are getting a wider range of units than we did in EU4. In the next question, so we can't force our armies to stay awake. The game only ticks from 8 AM to 7 PM in the entire game, or only for army movement and engagement. Now, this is one thing I got wrong in the dev diary. Nobody called it out in the comments, so I guess everyone else got it wrong as well, or didn't feel the need to correct me. So it's only combat and units that tick between those 2 times, between 8 and 7. The rest of the game actually ticks once per day. He did clarify this later on as well. So combat only ticks between those hours. There are some things that tick for the whole day, and then there are things that tick for the month. So the economy, I think he said, is pretty much bound across the whole month. So things aren't changing every day. I imagine that's to help with stability and how well the game's going to run. It's only the combat that ticks between that time. A lot of the stuff in the game isn't going to be being processed every hour between those times. A lot of the, you could say, day-to-day things only tick over once per day. They aren't all figured out every hour. So again, this should kind of ease some fears I think people had of like everything's going to be figured out in these hour slots every day. That's going to be a lot of stuff going on in the background. The game's going to run terribly. But it does sound like it's only the army side of the game that works in these hour slots. Pretty much everything else is either daily or monthly. So I think that does help us think that the game might run a little bit better than we thought it would if everything was happening on these hour timeframes. And then as I was just saying, Johan did clarify this, and that was actually the next question I picked out. So as I said, hour ticks are only for units and combat and movement. Day ticks are for construction and recruitment progress, and monthly ticks are for gain income, calculate trade, rebel progress. A lot of the like financial and actually like realm calculations are only done on a monthly basis. So again, this was just Johan clarifying that a little bit further. In the next question, a long question, but I will just narrow it down. They were asking what the correct section chance administrative ability referred to. This is one of the modifiers that a general could provide your army. And the player here just asking like, what does this mean? Does it mean they could go into the wrong flank and things like that? Johan clarifying, it's the chance when reinforcing a battle to end up in the correct box and not just in reserves. So I guess he's saying here, like, if your left-hand flank is starting to fall apart, if your general's not very good at correct section chance, he could try reinforcing people into the left flank, but they actually end up going into the right-hand flank or something like that, and that would potentially ruin a combat for you or something. I think that's what he means. I don't think he's saying, like, if you bring a second army in, those troops, if he had a really high-level general, could go straight into battle. I think that would go against what he said earlier. I think this is more just the general and how good he is at actually pushing the units into the correct flanks. He could goof it up, and then that could cause you major issues if he didn't reinforce the correct flank that was actually fighting in that fight. In the next question, is it feasible to have days tick for 3 to 5 speed and hour ticks for speeds 1 to 2? Johan's saying speed 5 puts all hour ticks into wood. So it sounds like from this, if you play the game 1 to 4, the 8 to 7 o'clock, you know, ticking over and then it skips back around to the beginning. But it sounds like from this, if you play the game at speed 5, everything just goes into the daily tick by the sounds of it. I'm not too sure. I think that's what he means. And when I was looking this up, it sounds like that's what people thought it meant as well. So do correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that is the case. I believe speed 5 puts all hour ticks into wood. I think that does mean if you play it at speed 5, it's more like playing EU4 where it's just a day every tick. I guess if you're playing at that speed, it is pretty good to do that. I think it makes probably a lot more sense rather than seeing a number just flicking around really, really quick as the hours tick over. And it probably like merges all the processing into one kind of like tick, as he says. So an interesting thing there that it does change it into one tick, but I think it probably does make sense just for a like ease of playing perspective. In the next question, ideally it would be possible for an attacker to lose a siege rather than victory being certain and only the time it takes being variable. This is actually a fantastic question. I imagine we'll get more information about this next week with the sieges part of the dev diary that we know is coming. But yeah, I never thought about this. If you play Crusader Kings, if you play EU4, you know, once you do a siege, if you have enough troops to actually tick the actual siege over, it's basically impossible to lose one. You can get so much attrition it fails, or obviously if another army comes and fights you, but if you have enough troops on a fort, it is just sat there kind of waiting for that number to tick over. In EU4, you're watching that percentage. You've got to wait for it to get up to like 55%, and then it never happens. And then sometimes when it says 2%, you get it straight away. You know how percentages work. And yeah, I never thought about this. Johan replying, though, that is the goal. They do actually want it to be where attacking armies that are sieging do actually fully fail sometimes in actually completing the siege. So I imagine this is going to be linked to logistics. From the hints we've seen, it looks like logistics are getting a major overhaul, and it is really going to affect how you're going to be able to move around the map, how sieges happen, things like that. So I can't wait for next week's dev diary. I think it's going to be very, very interesting how combat is changing, not from the actual fighting side that we saw this week, but the logistics of moving armies around. In the next question, do armies receive automatic reinforcements from the manpower pool even if they are in hostile territory, disconnected from friendly provinces or overseas in another continent? As I was just saying, this is going to be covered in next week's dev diary, and Johan pretty much just saying that no, they can't do this. It isn't going to be kind of like you can do in EU4, where you could just replenish them if they're in friendly territory or if they're in captured territory. They will slowly kind of reinforce and get better. Johan saying, no, this isn't the case. It is going to work differently, and they are going to cover it next week. As I was just saying, so this is going to be a major change. We'll see exactly next week how much of a change it's going to be. In the next question, does the fact that bombards and artillery start at the beginning mean they won't be firing throughout the rest of the battle, as was historical? I think the player really calling out that artillery carried on fighting. It wasn't just in the first phase, which it did sound like in the dev diary was the case. They only fought at the beginning. Johan saying, no, they do fight the rest of the fight as well. It's just that they have that initial kind of bombard phase at the beginning, which if you've seen any historical things like, you know, Sharp or something, obviously super historical. They did kind of start a lot of battles like that, have that initial artillery-ish phase, obviously not really artillery, but, you know, firing with the cannons, softening each other up as much as they could, and then the real battle got going. So I think it's more trying to recreate that. They are going to be fighting in the rest of the fight as well, not just that first phase. I can see how people could have got confused, though, by how it was worded. The next question, again around Doom stacks, this player saying, as I was kind of hinting towards earlier, is not Doom stacking viable because you could just keep piling people into the reserve pool and then your army will just last longer because it's got more in reserve. They could just survive longer and longer and longer. Johan's saying no, and this was kind of hinted at in the dev diary, but I didn't pick it up either. He's saying that the reserves take the morale hit every hour, the same as all the other units. Now, it was mentioned that every hour of the game, morale hit all the units. I didn't realize he meant the reserve units, but that is the case. So yeah, that isn't going to allow you to just constantly fill up the reserves and just carry on battles forever and ever and ever, because even the reserves take that morale hit. So eventually it is just going to break and the battle's going to kind of fall apart a little bit and maybe have like a stalemate to it. Just all the units end up breaking and then the battle will be inconclusive or something like that. Maybe we'll see that a little bit more. We won't get those, you know, full wipes or full conclusive battles. Maybe we will start getting more of these like stalemates of like no one really won. In the end, everyone kind of retreated away because their morale broke or they didn't get enough resources or something like that. So again, this is how it might change. Logistics next week should probably cover this as well, I would think. In the next question, this is for those of you who play at speed 4 or 5. The question here being, can we have an option where the game will slow down? Like in Imperator Rome, if a battle started, the game would automatically slow down to speed 2, and then you could speed it back up if you wanted to. Johan's showing off here the UI where you can actually do that. So game speed when war starts, no change. Or game speed when a selected unit enters combat, low speed. So you can have the game running at speed 5, and then if a battle breaks out, if a war starts, it will just automatically slow the game down. So I would think this is going to be very useful maybe for smaller realms that generally don't have a lot going on, and you're just kind of passing time, trying to do other things. You could play the game quickly, but if a rebel pops up, or, I don't know, someone just immediately starts a war with you, the game will automatically slow down for you. I imagine you'd be able to even set it to pause or something like that. So this is a cool addition. I always love options like this. It just make it easier for players to play how they want to. And then in the last question I picked out, is there any chance this game releases on PS5? I'd say 0 is Johan's reply. Now, does he mean it's coming out on PS6? I don't think so. I think if I'm being honest, Paradox have probably learned from Crusader Kings that, like, I don't think it's worth the effort for them to release these games on console. If you're watching this and you don't play Crusader Kings, it's a big kind of issue at the moment. The console edition, yes, it's always behind the PC edition. I think it's currently like 2 years behind on console, and they've had a lot of issues with the developer they kind of farmed it out to. They recently changed the developer, and there's just been no news about it. I did a video about it quite a while ago now. If you are interested, it's on the channel. I think it's titled like What's Happening with the Console Edition of CK3 or something like that. And yeah, I just kind of set out like what's happening with it. And then they did announce they're getting a new developer, but then it's been radio silent since then. I know a lot of console players are pretty frustrated with it, and I understand that. I don't play on console, but if you can only play on console, if you don't have a PC, you can't afford one, you don't have space for one maybe, and you just want to play some map painting, and you bought Crusader Kings 3, it is a good time, but you're so far behind, that's kind of annoying, but it's more annoying that they've got like major crashes with it, major bug issues, and they never really get any updates. I can see why they are frustrated, and I've always tried to champion it and said like, what's going on with the console edition? And I think maybe Johan's looked at that and thought like, it's not worth the trouble. It's really not worth the trouble trying to release this on a console, so we're not going to be doing that. No thank you. I've got bigger things to worry about than trying to get the game to work on a console and then supporting it and all of that kind of stuff. I'd be amazed if this comes out on console, if I'm honest. But with that, that is the last of the questions I picked out. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. As always, hit that like button if you have. Subscribe if you're new here. I'm covering EU5 up to official announcement, launch and beyond. And I cover Crusader Kings in a very similar manner. And I also talk about other grand strategy games as well on the channel. But we'll leave it there for today, and I'll see you in the next one.